Something happened in part 1 that shook Redemption Springs to its core. Now we see what follows when a man chooses the unthinkable. If you missed part 1, watch it first. This story deserves to be experienced from the beginning. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The cost came due faster than Caleb expected. Within a week, word reached the investors in San Francisco. Men in expensive suits who'd fronted capital for mine expansion. Men who measured success in quarterly returns and saw human life as a line item in operational expenses. They sent telegrams, urgent, demanding explanations for catastrophic losses and operational decisions that violated every principle of sound business management. Caleb sat in his office reading their words, cold assessments written by men who'd never descended into a mine shaft, never looked into the eyes of a widow wondering how to feed her children, never felt the weight of choosing between profit and humanity pressing down like tons of rock. Emergency board meeting requested stop your presence. Required San Francisco stop expect full accounting of recent decisions, stop shareholders, concerned stop. Blackstone stood by the window, silent, waiting. In the days since the collapse, his manner toward Caleb had changed. Not quite respect, not quite understanding, but something close to both. The acknowledgement that his employer had revealed depths he'd never suspected existed. "They're going to remove you," Blackstone said quietly. "You know that, don't you?" Caleb set down the telegram. "Probably. You risked everything for one man. One miner who wasn't even a foreman or engineer. Just a regular worker. They'll never understand that." "No, I don't suppose they will." "Was it worth it?" Caleb thought about Daniel Cooper lying in the hospital, leg amputated below the knee, but alive, surrounded by family, by children who still had a father, by a wife who'd watched her husband return from the grave. Yes, it was worth it. Blackstone turned from a window, met Caleb's eyes with something that might have been admiration. "I thought I knew you, Mr. Mercer. Thought I understood what drove you. Turns out I didn't know anything at all." "I didn't know myself, Blackstone. Not really. I built an empire thinking that was enough. Thinking success measured in silver and real estate and market share meant I'd accomplished something meaningful. But I was wrong." "What changed?" Caleb stood and walked to his own window, looked out over the town. His town, built by his vision and sustained by his capital, but inhabited by real people with real lives and real struggles that had nothing to do with quarterly profits. Mrs. Cooper changed it. When she stood in this office and asked me what I saw when I looked at her, I saw myself. Saw the boy I'd been before ambition turned me into something cold and calculating. Saw my own mother's face when they told her my father was dead, and I realized I'd become the kind of man I would have hated as a child. So what now? Now I go to San Francisco and face the consequences. They'll strip my controlling interest, install new management, probably sell off portions of the operation to recoup losses, and I'll let them, because holding on to power isn't worth becoming someone I can't recognize in the mirror. The journey to San Francisco took 3 days by train. Caleb watched the landscape transform through the window, desert giving way to foothills, foothills rising to mountains, mountains descending to valleys that eventually led to the sea. Each mile carried him further from Redemption Springs and deeper into the world of men who measured worth in ledgers and saw people as resources to be exploited. The board meeting was held in a mahogany-paneled room on the top floor of a building that overlooked the bay. 12 men in expensive suits, cigars and brandy, the trappings of wealth built on the labor of others. Caleb recognized most of them, had negotiated deals with them, shared drinks and sealed agreements that made them all rich. Now they looked at him like a liability to be managed. Harrison Pemberton led the meeting, old money from Boston, silver in his hair and steel in his voice. He'd never worked a day in his life, never risked anything but inherited capital, never made a decision that didn't factor profit above all else. Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming. I trust you understand why we've called this meeting. Caleb sat at the head of the table, the seat he'd occupied for 15 years, the position of power he'd clawed his way into through determination and ruthless business acumen. I understand perfectly. Good. Then you'll understand our concern regarding the incident at Mine 7. Preliminary assessments suggest losses exceeding $200,000. Operational delays that will impact production for at least 6 months. All because you chose to pursue a rescue operation our engineers advised against. That's correct. Pemberton's eyebrows rose. You admit this? I admit that I chose to save a man's life rather than abandon him to die in darkness. Yes. Murmurs around the table. Men exchanging glances. The arithmetic of the situation clear to everyone present. One life versus hundreds of thousands in capital. The mathematics couldn't be clearer. Mr. Mercer. Another investor spoke up. Charles Waverly. Railroad money. We understand the emotional appeal of such a decision. But you must see that it sets a dangerous precedent. We cannot run profitable operations if sentiment overrides sound business judgment. And we cannot call ourselves human if we value silver more than human life. The silence that followed was absolute. Caleb could see them processing his words, rejecting them, unable to comprehend a worldview where profit wasn't the ultimate measure of success. This is precisely what we feared, Pemberton said. You've lost your edge, Mercer. Lost the ability to make hard choices. The mining business is brutal. Men die. That's the reality of the industry. We cannot save everyone. Cannot risk everything for individual workers. If we operated that way, there would be no profitable mining operations anywhere in the West. Caleb leaned back in his chair, studied the faces around the table. Men who'd never descended into darkness, never felt mountain pressing down from above, never looked into the eyes of children waiting to learn if their father would come home. You're right, he said quietly. We cannot save everyone, but we can try to save someone. We can choose to see the men who work our mines as more than replaceable resources. We can build our empires on something other than calculated indifference to human suffering. Poetic, Waverly said dryly, but ultimately meaningless. We're here to make money, Mercer, not to save the world. And what do we do with that money, Waverly? Build bigger houses? Buy more land? Fill vaults with gold we'll never spend? At what point does accumulation become its own form of madness? This is ridiculous, Pemberton cut in. Clearly you've suffered some kind of breakdown. Mental strain from the incident. We're prepared to offer a generous severance package. Medical leave. Time to recover your senses. But we cannot allow you to continue making operational decisions. Caleb had known this was coming, had prepared himself for it during the long train ride. Yet hearing the words spoken aloud still carried weight. 15 years of building an empire. 15 years of clawing his way to the top. All being stripped away because he'd finally chosen humanity over profit. I understand, he said. You want my resignation. We want to protect the investment, both ours and yours. You still hold substantial equity, but operational control needs to transfer to someone who can make rational decisions without emotional interference. Someone like who? Blackstone, he's been suggested. Competent, loyal, understanding of the realities of the business. Caleb thought about Blackstone standing in his office, the confusion and eventual respect in his manager's eyes when Caleb had ordered the rescue to continue, the acknowledgement that there were more important things than quarterly profits. Blackstone will refuse, Caleb said. He understands now what I'm only beginning to grasp, that an empire built on human cost eventually crumbles, that you can own half the West and still die alone and empty if you've sacrificed your humanity to get there. Then we'll find someone else, Pemberton said coldly. Someone who hasn't lost sight of why we're in business. Your resignation, Mr. Mercer, today, or we'll force a vote and remove you anyway. Caleb stood slowly, looked around the table one final time, saw the future of mining operations in their faces, saw the continued reduction of human beings to numbers and ledgers, saw the machinery of progress grinding forward regardless of the cost in lives and souls. You'll have my resignation by end of business today, along with my recommendation that you sell my shares to the workers themselves. Let them own a piece of the operation they risk their lives for. Let them have a voice in decisions that affect whether they live or die underground. The laughter that greeted this suggestion was harsh and dismissive. Absurd, Waverly said. Workers as shareholders? That's not how capital operates, Mercer. No, it's not. But maybe it should be. Maybe an empire built on shared stake and mutual respect would last longer than one built on exploitation and indifference. Pemberton stood, extended his hand, the gesture of a man concluding business. We're sorry it had to end this way, Mercer. You built something impressive. Just couldn't maintain the discipline required to sustain it. Caleb ignored the hand, walked to the door, paused with his hand on the brass handle. Look back one final time. I hope you never face the choice I faced. I hope you never have to look into the eyes of a woman whose husband is dying in darkness and explain that his life isn't worth the cost of saving it. Because if you do, you'll discover what I discovered. That all the silver in the West isn't worth what you lose when you stop being human. He left them sitting in their mahogany room, left the empire he'd built, left the power and prestige and wealth he'd accumulated through 15 years of ruthless ambition, and felt lighter than he had in decades. The train back to Redemption Springs moved through the same landscape in reverse, coast to valley, valley to mountain, mountain to foothills, foothills to desert, each mile carrying him away from the world of pure capital and back towards something more real, more human, more true. He didn't know what waited for him in Redemption Springs. Didn't know if he'd remain involved in mining operations or walk away completely. Didn't know if the workers would accept his offer of shared ownership or if the investors would simply install new management and continue as before. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Daniel Cooper was alive, for children still had their father. One woman hadn't become another widow created by the machinery of progress, and that was worth everything he'd lost. The desert rolled past outside the window, endless and unforgiving and beautiful in its harsh honesty. Caleb watched it with new eyes, saw not resources to be extracted, but a land that demanded respect, a frontier that broke men who thought they could conquer it, but taught profound truths to those willing to listen. He'd come to the West as a young man, hungry for success, built an empire through determination and ruthless calculation, became the Silver King, became someone men feared and admired and envied. And only now, stripped of power and position, was he finally learning what it meant to be human. The sun set red over the distant mountains, blood red, like it had the night before everything changed. Caleb watched it sink below the horizon and felt something inside himself settle. Some peace he hadn't known he'd been seeking. Whatever came next, he'd face it as himself. Not as the Silver King, not as the ruthless businessman, but as Caleb Mercer, a man who'd made terrible choices and built an empire on human cost, but also a man who'd finally chosen humanity over profit when it mattered most. That would have to be enough. Caleb returned to Redemption Springs to find everything changed. The town looked the same. Same dusty streets, same weathered buildings, same mountains rising in the distance like ancient sentinels watching over human folly. But something fundamental had shifted. Something invisible but profound as the difference between silver ore and worthless rock. People looked at him differently now. Not with the fearful respect of workers toward an employer who controlled their livelihoods. Not with the calculating deference of those who needed favors from the powerful. But with something warmer, more human. The acknowledgement that he'd proven himself capable of choosing right over profitable. The first place he visited was the hospital. Daniel Cooper lay in a narrow bed near the window where afternoon sun painted stripes across threadbare blankets. His left leg ended in bandages just below the knee. His face was gaunt from weeks of recovery and limited food, but his eyes were clear, alert, alive with gratitude that went deeper than words could express. Mrs. Cooper sat beside the bed. Same worn dress, same work-hardened hands, but her face had transformed. The desperate fear that had haunted her features was gone, replaced by cautious hope, by the fragile possibility that maybe life held something other than endless struggle and grinding loss. "Mr. Mercer," Daniel said softly, "heard you went to San Francisco. Heard they gave you hell for what you did." Caleb pulled up a chair, sat down level with the injured man, instead of standing above him the way the Silver King would have. "They did. Force my resignation. Strip my operational control. I no longer run the mining operations I built. I'm sorry. That's my fault. If I hadn't—" "Stop." Caleb's voice was firm but kind. "You have nothing to apologize for. The choice was mine. The consequences are mine. And I'd make the same choice again tomorrow." Mrs. Cooper spoke for the first time. "Why? You barely knew Daniel. Didn't owe us anything. Why risk everything for a man you'd never even spoken to before?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, children played in the street. Normal life continuing despite catastrophe and transformation. The eternal rhythm of humanity enduring regardless of individual struggles. Because I'd forgotten something important. I'd forgotten that empires crumble, but human dignity lasts forever. I'd forgotten that silver tarnishes, but the memory of doing right shines brighter with time. I'd forgotten what my own mother told me when I was a boy barely old enough to understand. The man who has everything, but his humanity has nothing at all. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "I'll pay you back. Somehow. I'll work again soon as this leg heals proper. The doctor says I can still work above ground. Manage supply lines maybe. Coordinate shipments. Whatever you need, Mr. Mercer. I owe you my life. You owe me nothing. But if you want to help me with something I'm trying to build. Something different from what came before. Anything." Caleb leaned forward, shared the idea that had been forming during the long train ride back from San Francisco. The vision that had crystallized while watching desert transform to mountain transform back to desert. A different kind of empire. One built on shared stake instead of exploitation. On mutual respect instead of calculated indifference. I still own substantial equity in the mining operations. Enough to have influence even without operational control. I want to use that influence to create a workers' cooperative. Give the men who risk their lives underground a voice in how the mines operate. A share in the profits they generate. Safety protocols that prioritize human life over production quotas. Daniel stared at him. That's unheard of. No mining operation in the West works that way. Then maybe it's time one did. Maybe it's time we proved that profit and humanity aren't mutually exclusive. That an empire built on respect lasts longer than one built on fear. Mrs. Cooper's hand found her husband's, squeezed tight. "What do you need from us?" "I need Daniel to talk to the other miners. Gauge interest in this kind of arrangement. I need voices from the ground telling me what actually makes sense instead of investors in San Francisco making decisions based on quarterly reports. I need partners instead of employees." Over the following weeks, Caleb worked to restructure everything he'd built. It wasn't easy. The new management installed by the San Francisco investors resisted every change, saw workers' cooperatives as dangerous radicalism that threatened the natural order of capital and labor. Blackstone, to his credit, proved an unlikely ally. He'd seen something in Caleb's choice that resonated, had witnessed firsthand that different approaches to business were possible. Together, they held meetings in the evenings after shifts ended. Small gatherings at first, dozen men at most. Caleb laying out his vision while miners listened with skeptical faces. They'd been promised things before. Promised better wages and safer conditions and respect for their labor. But promises from management rarely materialized into action. "Why should we trust you?" One miner asked. Tough Irishman named O'Brien who'd lost friends in cave-ins and floods and all the casual disasters that plague mining operations. "You're still the Silver King. Still the man who built his fortune on our backs." Caleb didn't flinch from the accusation. You shouldn't trust me. Not based on words alone. But watch what I do in the coming months. Watch whether my actions match my promises. Then decide whether this cooperative makes sense. Slowly, grudgingly, support built. Daniel Cooper proved invaluable. He spoke to miners in language they understood, explained the cooperative structure without fancy terminology or manipulation. Just honest assessment of what they stood to gain and what risks they'd assume as partial owners rather than simple employees. The turning point came when Caleb announced he was converting his own equity into cooperative shares, giving up personal ownership to create a pool of stock that workers could purchase at rates subsidized by his own capital, essentially dismantling his empire and redistributing it to the men who'd actually built it with their labor and risk. The announcement spread through Redemption Springs like wildfire. People couldn't believe it. The Silver King voluntarily surrendering wealth and power, converting ownership into shared equity. It violated every principle of how capital operated in the West. It challenged the fundamental assumption that those with money deserved control, while those with labor deserved only wages. But Caleb was serious, deadly serious. He met with lawyers, drew up articles of incorporation for the cooperative, established voting structures where every worker-owner had equal voice regardless of share amount, created safety committees with binding authority to shut down dangerous operations, built accountability systems where management served workers instead of the reverse. The San Francisco investors fought him at every step. They filed injunctions, threatened lawsuits, called in political favors to block the cooperative's formation. Pemberton himself traveled to Redemption Springs to personally confront Caleb in a meeting that became legendary in local lore. You're destroying everything you built, Pemberton raged, creating a precedent that will undermine mining operations across the entire West. Workers aren't meant to own enterprises. They're meant to labor for those with vision and capital. Caleb faced him calmly. And how's that vision working out? How many men dead in pursuit of quarterly profits? How many widows created so shareholders in San Francisco can collect dividends? How many children growing up without fathers because operational efficiency mattered more than human life? That's the cost of progress. No, that's the cost of greed disguised as progress. Real progress would be building something sustainable, something that enriches everyone involved instead of concentrating wealth at the top, while those doing actual work barely survive. The argument went nowhere, ended with Pemberton threatening complete divestment and Caleb calling his bluff. The investors eventually realized they had limited options. They could fight the cooperative and lose everything in prolonged legal battles, or they could accept reduced returns in exchange for continued involvement in what remained a profitable operation. They chose profit, as Caleb knew they would. 6 months after the collapse of Mine 7, the Redemption Springs Mining Cooperative held its first official meeting. 200 workers packed into the largest building in town. Men who'd spent careers taking orders now faced with the responsibility of shared ownership. The weight of it showed on their faces. This wasn't just better wages or safer conditions. This was fundamental transformation of their relationship to work and capital and their own futures. Caleb stood before them, not as the Silver King, not as management dictating terms, but as one voice among many in an enterprise where every voice carried equal weight. Gentlemen, he began, we're attempting something unprecedented here, building a mining operation where those who risk their lives underground have actual say in how that risk is managed, where profits are shared among those who generate them, where safety matters as much as production. He paused. Let the significance settle. This won't be easy. We'll make mistakes. Face opposition from those who believe the old ways are the only ways. Struggle with decisions that pitch short-term profit against long-term sustainability. But we'll face those challenges together, as partners, as equals, as human beings who refuse to accept that empire must be built on human cost. The miners voted that night on their first major decision, whether to reopen sections of Mine 7, whether to risk returning to the tunnels that had nearly claimed Daniel Cooper's life. The engineers had assessed the damage, declared portions salvageable with extensive shoring and reduced production quotas. From a pure profit standpoint, reopening made sense. But this time, profit wasn't the only consideration. The miners debated for hours, weighed financial gain against safety concerns, considered whether symbolic avoidance of the dangerous mine mattered more than practical revenue, struggled with the complexity of decisions they'd never had to make as simple employees. Finally, they voted. Mine 7 would remain closed, sealed permanently as a monument to the cost of choosing profit over humanity. Other mines would be expanded, new shafts explored, but that particular hole in the ground would stay dark, a reminder that some choices matter more than quarterly returns. Caleb voted with them, one voice among 200. His vote carried no more weight than the newest worker who joined the cooperative last week. The Silver King had abdicated his throne, chosen partnership over power, community over control. That night, walking through the darkened streets of Redemption Springs, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Peace. Not the satisfaction of closed deals or accumulated wealth. Not the pride of empire built through ruthless determination, but the quiet contentment of knowing he'd finally chosen right over profitable. Finally valued human life above silver and capital and all the glittering illusions of success that had driven him for so long. He passed the sealed entrance to Mine 7, stood there in the darkness, listening to the silence. Somewhere deep in that mountain, the tunnels where Daniel Cooper had nearly died remained undisturbed, the silver veins untapped, the potential wealth abandoned in favor of something more valuable, the memory of choosing humanity when it mattered most. Caleb Mercer had come to the West as a young man hungry for success, had built an empire through determination and ruthless calculation, had become the Silver King, had lost it all in one decision that prioritized one man's life over profit and logic and everything he'd thought mattered, and in losing everything, had finally found what he'd been seeking all along. Not empire, not wealth, not power or prestige, or the fearful respect of those who depended on him, but the simple dignity of being human. The stars blazed above Redemption Springs like scattered silver across infinite darkness. Caleb watched them and thought about his mother, about the woman who'd raised him in Chicago's gutters and taught him that a man's worth had nothing to do with what he owned, everything to do with what he was willing to sacrifice when the moment demanded it. She died before seeing him build his empire, died never knowing her son had become the Silver King. But somehow, standing in the darkness beneath those brilliant stars, Caleb thought maybe she knew now, knew that her boy had finally learned a lesson she tried to teach him decades ago, that the true measure of a man isn't what he builds, it's what he's willing to lose when holding on would cost him his humanity. 5 years passed like water through fingers. Redemption Springs grew, not with the explosive chaos of a boom town chasing silver, but with the steady confidence of a community building something meant to last. The cooperative model spread slowly. Other mining operations watched with skeptical interest. Some dismissed it as naive idealism doomed to fail. Others recognized the stability it created and wondered if they'd been wrong about the nature of capital and labor all along. Caleb spent those years learning to be ordinary. It was harder than building an empire had ever been, harder than negotiating with investors or calculating risk, harder than any decision he'd made when power and wealth insulated him from consequence, because being ordinary meant being accountable, meant sitting in meetings where his voice carried no more weight than the 19-year-old miner fresh from Kansas, meant accepting democratic decisions he disagreed with, meant trusting that collective wisdom would prevail even when his experience screamed otherwise. Some days he succeeded. Others he struggled with old instincts toward control. But he kept trying, kept showing up to meetings and listening more than talking, kept learning that partnership required different skills than dominance, that shared ownership demanded patience and faith in ways empire never had. The cooperative wasn't perfect. Nothing involving humans ever is. They made mistakes, miscalculated production quotas, voted for expansion that proved too ambitious, struggled with conflicts between individual wants and collective needs, discovered that democracy was messy and slow and frustrating in ways autocracy never was. But nobody died unnecessarily. Safety protocols held even when production suffered. Workers voted to shut down dangerous operations instead of gambling lives for profit. And when accidents happened, because in mining, accidents always happened, the community bore the cost together instead of leaving families to survive alone. Daniel Cooper never returned to underground work. His missing leg saw to that. Instead, he became the cooperative's safety coordinator, toured the mines with engineers, listened to worker concerns, advocated for protocols that prioritized human life even when it complicated operations. His presence served as constant reminder of what they'd almost lost, what they'd chosen to save at enormous cost. His children grew. Oldest daughter married a young miner who joined the cooperative fresh from Missouri, worked her way to leadership positions despite the skepticism of men who thought women had no place in mining operations, proved them wrong through competence and determination, became living proof that transformation could extend beyond just capital and labor. Mrs. Cooper never forgot what Caleb had done, never forgot the choice that saved her husband and changed everything. She worked in the cooperative store, served on committees, became voice for families in discussions that might otherwise focus only on production and profit, reminded everyone that behind every worker stood people who depended on them, people whose lives were shaped by decisions made in boardrooms and mine shafts. Caleb's mansion stood empty for 3 years before he finally sold it. The buyers were a doctor and his wife relocating from Boston, young couple drawn by stories of this experimental community where workers owned their future. They filled the empty rooms with children's laughter and medical practice and the ordinary chaos of lives being lived. Caleb watched them move in from a distance, felt no regret for what he'd lost, only quiet satisfaction that the monument to his empire now served more human purposes. He lived in a modest house near the center of town. 2 rooms, simple furniture, nothing ornate or expensive, everything he actually needed and nothing designed to impress. From his front porch, he could watch town life unfold. Children playing, workers walking to shifts, women gathering at the store to share news and gossip. The texture of community that had been invisible to him when he'd lived apart on his hilltop, surveying his domain like a king. Word of the Redemption Springs experiment spread beyond mining circles. Labor organizers visited, asked questions, took notes, tried to understand how it worked and whether it could be replicated. Some came as skeptics looking to prove it couldn't last. Others arrived as believers seeking validation for ideas they'd been dismissed for holding. All left with more questions than answers, because the truth was complicated. Success wasn't guaranteed. The model worked here in this specific place with these specific people. Whether it could thrive elsewhere remained unknown, but the attempt mattered. The experiment itself carried weight beyond practical outcomes. Thomas Blackstone remained with the operation in an advisory role. The San Francisco investors had wanted him to lead, but he'd refused. Recognized that the cooperative needed leadership from within, management chosen by workers rather than imposed by capital. He helped structure systems and processes, provided continuity during transition, then stepped back and let the cooperative find its own way. He and Caleb became unlikely friends, spent evenings on one porch or another drinking coffee and discussing the nature of work and capital and human dignity, wrestling with questions that had no simple answers, finding companionship and shared recognition that everything they'd believed about business had been incomplete at best, dangerous at worst. Do you regret it? Blackstone asked one evening, giving up everything you built. Caleb watched the sun set over distant mountains, same red color as the night before everything changed, same eternal rhythm of day yielding to darkness, yielding back to light. I regret what I did to build it, how many men I used and discarded, how many families I left struggling while I accumulated wealth I didn't need. How long it took me to understand that empire built on human cost isn't empire at all, just gilded cruelty. But the choice itself, saving Cooper, That's the only decision I've made in 20 years I don't regret at all. On the 5th anniversary of Mine 7's collapse, the cooperative held ceremony at the sealed entrance. Entire town gathered, workers and families, children too young to remember the original events, but raised on stories of the miracle rescue and the transformation that followed. Mrs. Cooper stood beside Daniel, their children grown and starting families of their own. Evidence that the choice had rippled forward through time in ways impossible to calculate. Caleb stood in back, not at the center of attention, just one member of community gathering to remember, to acknowledge, to commit themselves again to principles that put humanity before profit. Daniel spoke, voice steady despite emotion. 5 years ago, I lay trapped in darkness, thinking my life was over, thinking my children would grow up without their father, thinking my wife would face the world alone. But something happened that changed everything. Not just for me, for all of us. He gestured toward the sealed mine entrance. This hole in the ground represents a choice. The choice to value life over silver, people over profit, human dignity over quarterly returns. Some called it foolish, said it would bankrupt us, predicted the cooperative would fail within months. He smiled, looked around at the faces gathered. They were wrong. We're still here, still mining, still profitable, still learning that there are better ways to build something that lasts. His eyes found Caleb in the crowd, held his gaze, and we owe it to one man who had everything and was willing to lose it all because he remembered what it meant to be human. The crowd turned, found Caleb standing there trying to remain invisible, began to applaud, not the fearful deference of employees toward a powerful boss, but the genuine respect of equals acknowledging someone who'd done hard thing when easy path beckoned. Caleb felt tears sting his eyes. Unexpected, unwelcome, undeniable. He'd spent 20 years building empire and never felt this. Never felt the warmth of community appreciation. Never experienced the profound satisfaction of being recognized not for what he owned, but for who he'd chosen to become. After the ceremony, families dispersed to evening meals and private conversations. Caleb walked alone toward the edge of town, to the place where desert met civilization, where the wild country stretched infinite and unforgiving, where a man could stand and remember that all human endeavors were temporary, that empires crumbled and towns disappeared, and everything built eventually returned to dust. But some things endured. The memory of choosing right, the ripples of one decision flowing forward through years and lives and generations. The knowledge that he'd failed spectacularly at being the Silver King, but succeeded at something more important, at being human in moment that demanded it. He thought about his mother, the woman who'd died in poverty but rich in dignity, who'd taught him that wealth meant nothing if you lost yourself acquiring it, who'd lived and died believing that the measure of a man was what he was willing to sacrifice for others. "I finally understand, Ma," he whispered to the empty desert. "Took me 40 years and losing everything, but I finally understand." The wind carried his words away. Same wind that had blown across these lands before humans arrived with their dreams and ambitions and illusions of permanence. Same wind that would blow long after all traces of Redemption Springs had vanished into geological time. But for now, in this moment, the town thrived. The cooperative endured. Families lived and worked and built futures on foundation of shared ownership and mutual respect. And Caleb Mercer, once the Silver King, lived as ordinary member of extraordinary community, not because he'd built an empire, but because he'd had the courage to tear it down. That's the story folks round here still tell. Story of how the Silver King lost his crown and found his humanity. How one choice changed everything for a man who thought he had all the answers. How empire built on silver crumbled while something more valuable rose from the ruins. I was there for most of it. Watched it unfold from edges of things the way old men do. Saw Caleb Mercer transform from ruthless businessman into someone struggling to be simply human. Saw the cooperative take root and spread. Saw Redemption Springs become something different from every other mining town bleeding the West dry. Whether it lasted beyond my knowing, I can't say. Time has a way of eroding even the best intentions. But for those years I witnessed, something genuine happened in that dusty town. Something that proved humanity and profit weren't enemies. That success measured in lives preserved mattered more than success counted and silver extracted. Caleb died years after these events. Quiet death in his sleep, surrounded by nothing expensive or impressive. Just the simple furniture of an ordinary life well lived. The whole town mourned him, not as the Silver King, but as Caleb, as partner and friend and the man who'd shown them different ways were possible. They buried him near Mine 7, near the sealed entrance to the place where he'd made the choice that defined him. His gravestone was simple, just his name and dates. No titles, no mentions of empire or wealth or power. Beneath his name, they carved one line. He chose humanity when it mattered most. That's all any of us can hope for, really. That when the moment comes, when we stand at the crossroads between profit and principle, between power and partnership, between empire and humanity, we choose right even when it costs everything. Caleb Mercer did. And that's why his story still echoes through these territories all these years later. Not as cautionary tale, but as a reminder that redemption is always possible, that we can build empires and lose them and find in the ruins something more valuable than we ever knew we were missing. The Wild West was harsh, unforgiving, built on blood and broken promises, and the calculated cost of human life measured against silver and gold. But sometimes, in rare moments, someone chose different, chose to tear down what they'd built rather than sacrifice their humanity to maintain it. And those moments shine brighter than all the silver ever pulled from these mountains. That's the end of it. The story of Caleb Mercer and the price he paid to remember what it meant to be human. May we all be so brave when our own moments come. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.